Welcome to the Association for Research and Enlightenment here in Virginia Beach, Virginia, the home of the Edgar Cayce readings. What if? What if? What if? Maybe Bob Dylan said it right. Maybe we can blame it all on a simple twist of fate. So let me tell you a story today, a story of great irony. Now this story encompasses several individuals and elements. Of course, it includes the great psychic from Hopkinsville, Kentucky, the humble American mystic, Edgar Cayce. And it also includes the man called the greatest thinker in American history. I'll also bring another player into this drama, John Oliver of HBO fame. And then finally, answer the question, what if? What if? What could have happened and perhaps still could be? Now, a lot of the stories we hear about Edgar Cayce, some of the most fascinating stories I find from Sidney and Nancy Kirkpatrick, are all those celebrated individuals who got readings from Edgar Cayce. We've heard about Tesla and Edison and Gershwin, maybe President Wilson, Pickford. I can name dozens of others. But some of the greatest Edgar Cayce stories are the near misses, those whose path never quite crossed with Edgar Cayce. Now, you heard from Carol Sue Janes earlier, great speaker, amazing researcher and writer. She has written often about Howard Thurman, the great African-American mystic who probably had the greatest influence on the life of Martin Luther King, and how Thurman was very interested in the work of Edgar Cayce. In fact, reached out to the A.R.E. Sadly, Edgar was already dead, but Thurman did interact with Gladys Davis, and he actually came to the A.R.E. some years later. But there's another near miss in this story. Whereas Howard Thurman was a little too late to meet Mr. Cayce, the man I'm referencing today was just a little too early. And again, he and Cayce's paths never crossed, but they came scintillatingly close. The man I'm referring to today is called by some the greatest thinker in American history. His name, William James, the father of American psychology, the author of the Varieties of Religious Experience. And William James came by it very honestly. He was born into American intellectual and spiritual royalty. His father, Henry James Sr., was an author, a Swedenborgian theologian. He was a real estate magnate and an abolitionist. He hobnobbed with the great transcendentalists. His brother, Henry James Jr., set the world on fire with his great writing. He was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize 3 times. Even his sister turned out to be a great author. His godfather was a transcendentalist, Ralph Waldo Emerson. And later in his life, Bill Wilson, Bill W. in AA circles, said that William James was the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous. William James would attend Harvard University. He would attend Harvard Medical School. He would graduate as a venerated doctor. But more than that, he would be the first chair of Harvard's Department of Psychology. This is where he pioneered the study of psychology and religion. W.E. Du Bois, Gertrude Stein, Theodore Roosevelt, all were students of William James. James pushed the bounds of consciousness. He forever changed how we see the mind and spirituality. But more than that, William James was fascinated by something else. William James was fascinated by the psychic, by the paranormal, by the telepathic, the clairvoyant. So much so that he joined Madame Blavatsky's Theosophical Society. And this is lost to American history. How sad. William James was the co-founder of the American Society for Psychical Research. That's right. William James took psychic research seriously. He was intrigued by the validity of psi phenomenon. But as the first decade of the 20th century came to a close, William James's life and his light were ebbing, just at the same time that Edgar Cayce's light was beginning to burn bright. The linchpin year is 1910. Cayce's miraculous psychic health readings are wowing doctors, so much so that the New York Times writes a cover story on him that autumn. This is only mere weeks after William James has passed away. And the mantle had already been passed at Harvard from William James to his hand-picked successor, Hugo Munsterberg, Now, for those of you who have read this extraordinary book, True Tales from the Vault, or from the Edgar Cayce archives, I should get the title right, right? Just read it on vacation, reread it, great book. Hugo Munsterberg plays a rather pivotal role in the Cayce story. In fact, there's a chapter in the book called Harvard Comes to Hopkinsville. Hugo Munsterberg was William James's successor, but Hugo Munsterberg was no William James, because throughout his career he was committed. He was a committed opponent to parapsychology. He prided himself on what he called a great record of exposing mediums and other psychic charlatans. Now, Munsterberg had made a name for himself years earlier. He had exposed the great Italian psychic Eusapia Palladino, and she was known for her seances throughout Europe and throughout the world. And on one occasion, Munsterberg actually tricked her. He sent an acolyte to one of her seances, and they found out that the music that was playing spontaneously from instruments that had no human accompaniment, to rising tables, to wind blowing through the room, were all sleights of hand. Munsterberg exposed Palladino for the fraud she was. And from there on, Munsterberg kind of built his career on this street cred. He wanted to expose psychics for who they were. That doctor, that Harvard doctor, Hugo Munsterberg, is probably the amazing Randy of his day. See, for Munsterberg, the truth was plain on its face. Paranormal phenomena isn't real, and all of those who claim any psychic powers are charlatans. Now, after William James passes away, his influence still holds some sway at Harvard, but Munsterberg now is trying to do everything he possibly can to undermine James's legacy, especially as it relates to the paranormal. And 1911 also turns out to be a very key year as well, because months after the New York Times article appears, Dr. Wesley Ketchum, the doctor that is working in tandem with Edgar Cayce, it's his business partner in some ways, trying to get the Cayce story out, actually writes a scholarly paper on Cayce's gifts. And guess what? He's invited to give a presentation at Harvard. It attracts so much attention that literally thousands of physicians show up to Boston. Well, when Hugo Munsterberg hears about Ketchum's discourse, he is enraged. He makes up his mind right then and there. He's going to travel to Hopkinsville, Kentucky. I will expose Cayce to the world, he says. Now, I hope I get the details right, and I hope I can convey some of the color that Sid and Nancy share in the True Tales book. But can you imagine? Munsterberg comes to little old Hopkinsville, Kentucky. He shows up on Cayce's doorstep unannounced. He's wearing a long beaver coat, pince-nez glasses. He's got a gold-plated walking stick. The man is 6 foot plus and 250 pounds. He must have been an imposing figure. And yet, Cayce is not thrown. He invites him into his house. He introduces him to his 3-year-old child, Hugh Lynn. And he also walks him briefly into the bedroom where his wife, Gertrude, is recovering from tuberculosis. Now, Munsterberg gets up and is flustered. He wants to know from Cayce where his lights are, where his rising table is, where's your crystal ball? Cayce doesn't know what he's talking about. Munsterberg ups and leaves in a huff. But Munsterberg's going to be in Hopkinsville for a full week. He will make 2 more trips to the Cayce household. The second time that Munsterberg appears at the Cayce household, he's there to examine. But he's not there to examine Edgar. He's there to examine Gertrude. Now, unbeknownst to the Cayces at the time, tuberculosis had touched Munsterberg and his life very deeply. Several of his friends and family members, including a beloved stepmother, had all succumbed to tuberculosis. Now, here was Munsterberg at the top of the medical world. He was considered by some one of the greatest doctors in America. And yet he was powerless when it came to tuberculosis. In those days, tuberculosis was virtually a death sentence. It's like cancer was 50 or 60 years ago. And yet here he was in the presence of someone who was recovering from this dreaded disease. And it wasn't because she had followed some orthodox medical advice. She had gotten a reading from her husband which recommended some outrageous therapies. And it was because of that that she was on her road to recovery. Now, there was a third time that Munsterberg also appeared at the Cayce home. He actually gets an opportunity to witness a reading. He's in a doorway to the room where Edgar is giving a live reading to a person who had some physical problems. And after the reading, Munsterberg got a chance to interview that person who had the reading, had a chance to talk to his doctor, and as a matter of fact, talked to numerous people that week who had interacted with Cayce, who had had readings from Edgar Cayce, talked to the doctors who were doing the medical records for these patients. And Munsterberg goes through many of these medical records. He goes through the readings. And here, the great man from Harvard, the man at the top of the medical world who wanted to expose this psychic fraud, had to sit back and admit that Edgar Cayce was the real deal, that he was genuine. He had some power that Munsterberg could not figure out or put his finger on, but somehow Cayce's gifts were healing people in this world. And he pulled Edgar aside and he said, "You do have a great gift. Keep doing what you're doing." He encouraged him to keep pursuing the gifts, the fruits of those gifts. He also did Edgar a favor, because by looking through the readings and some of the medical records, he was actually able to discern that Dr. Wesley Ketchum was actually defrauding his business partner, Edgar Cayce. It was the beginning of the end between Cayce and Ketchum. But rather than go back to Harvard and use that platform to the world, to tell the world of the great healing powers that had come through this man, Edgar Cayce, especially as it related to tuberculosis, Hugo Munsterberg stayed silent. Ego, not the beneficent help to humankind, guided his actions. You have to wonder how many lives could have potentially been saved, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions, if Munsterberg had taken that step. Now, when it comes to assessing psychic phenomenon, Munsterberg left a huge legacy, one that still survives today. Here's HBO comedian John Oliver.
Before we go any further, I am not going to be litigating whether psychics are real in this piece. For one, they're not. See? No litigation required. Also, for anyone who does believe in psychic powers, I know there is nothing I could say that could convince you otherwise. Logic isn't the reason that you believe in them, and it won't be the reason that you stop. And you might say at this point, hold on, where is the downside in telling people their grandmother loved them? But I would argue that at best, it is reckless for a stranger to take a stab at ventriloquizing the dead. Loss is complicated and mourning doesn't look the same for everyone. But at worst, when psychic abilities are presented as authentic, it emboldens a vast underworld of unscrupulous vultures, more than happy to make money by offering an open line to the afterlife, as well as many other bullshit services.
Now, this comes from an episode where John Oliver is talking about psychics and how they are frauds. I couldn't play the entire segment for you, but Oliver basically makes the same conclusion that Munsterberg did, and that is psychic phenomenon is not real, and if you're following a psychic for information or advice, you're being fooled. Now, I like a lot of John Oliver's work. He does in-depth journalistic investigations. I think it's very necessary, but Oliver got it wrong for this one reason. His statement that all psychics are frauds it's kind of like saying all doctors are quacks, or all lawyers are shysters, or all accountants are cheats. Maybe those professions have a greater pro rata share of their frauds. But it doesn't mean that all psychics are frauds. And William James had a very interesting quote on this very topic. He said this: "If you wish to upset the law that all crows are black, you mustn't seek to show that no crows are. It is enough if you prove one single crow to be white." Edgar Cayce was that crow. Now, it might be that psychics aren't frauds, some of them are, but many of them are just not that talented. You know, if you're a baseball player and you're hitting 200, or if you're hitting 333, those who are hitting 200 are on their way out of the majors. Those who are hitting 333 are on their way to Cooperstown. In the intuitive psychic world, Edgar Cayce was more than an all-star. He was a Hall of Famer. He was the Babe Ruth of the psychical world, of the paranormal. And yet Munsterberg could only share Cayce's remarkable stories in private, never publicly, because he thought it would cost him too much professionally. So, what if? What if? What if William James had lived long enough? What if William James ended up on that doorstep at Cayce's home in Hopkinsville? This man who had great veneration for medical science, for psychology, and for the paranormal. How would he have treated the Cayce phenomenon? Would he have gone back to Harvard and spoken before his colleagues in Emerson Hall and talked about the miracle man from Kentucky who could actually go into trance and give psychic readings, and even people with tuberculosis could be cured? How would the trajectory of American medical history have been changed? How would the spiritual history of America have changed? Sadly, with the death of William James and the advent of the Hugo Munsterbergs of the world, science and medicine began to move largely towards materialism. Popular religion began to tack more closely to fundamentalism in America. But maybe 100 years later or so, maybe that's all ready to change. William James has been cited as the main influence on what we loosely call the New Age. Edgar Cayce has sometimes been called the father of the New Age. William James coined the term New Thought, stating that the human mind is the supreme channel for powerful healing and creative forces. That sounds a lot like Cayce's mind is the builder philosophy, doesn't it? James pictured the day when New Thought, the religion of the healthy mindedness, would become the predominant spiritual expression in the United States. And Cayce believed that the universal thought and the brotherhood of man, as expressed in the American ideal, was the great hope of the world. These men never met. Maybe that was just a simple twist of fate. But today, their philosophies are coinciding. They are converging. They are emerging. Maybe not on a grand scale. Maybe it hasn't materialized largely, not yet. But after all, the arc of the universe is long, and it does bend towards truth.
Tens of thousands of people visit Edgar Cayce's Association for Research and Enlightenment every year. They attend daily lectures, participate in weekly programs and conferences, visit the library, read books, and consult with the staff. To this day, the most documented psychic intuitive of all time continues to impact the lives of millions of people around the world.